Dennis, my clock shows 5:30.
Let's do it.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Dennis Earle. I teach at Syracuse University. I teach history of design classes. Sorry, my voice is a little scratchy. I've been a little under the weather. So if you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll turn on my professor voice and stun you. I want to talk today about this idea of the world coming to this place. My teaching is very much involved with place and environment. I look at things. I ask my students to look at things, architecture, design things of all kinds, also environments. But I want them to think about places too, and to think about when you put things in places and people in places, what does it mean? How does it change the meaning of being in that place? And how does it change the meaning of what that thing is? And how those people think in that new place. So culture goes to a new place, it changes. And so you have to forgive me, not just for my crackly voice today, but also I don't really know that much. This isn't really this area. Not something I know much about. This is pretty, looking specifically at this area, even though I'm from New York State, not something I know that much about. So I just plunged in, but I'm interested in the things I'm interested in, so I hope it'll be interesting to you. I would like to encourage you to just raise your hand and let it be conversational now and again if it feels like it could be. And especially since some of you may know some of the local information that I just don't know. And so not only am I happy to be corrected, but I'm also happy to have little sidebar conversations as we go, because I don't have a set text. You're not going to be interrupting a speech that's all written out. I just have a bunch of scribbled notes and a lot of information and a certain amount of excitement about some ideas that are new for me that I want to try out on you. So I think of this a little bit like when I was doing a master's thesis and I had to try it out on my mentors. How does this sound? So let's look at it that way. I had this idea about the world coming to here because, I mean, obviously we're on the St. Lawrence River. It's a major seaway. It sort of suggests itself, that idea that this is a place that you want to come to, that people have been coming to for a long time. And so this is Jefferson County. I was looking at the zone from, the end of the lake, the beginning of the river, up to the Thousand Islands Bridge, more or less, or to Alexandria Bay. But also I found that some of the history was really interesting from inland too. So I kind of looked at the Luray and Champion and this kind of middle area that seemed to stand out in some of the history that I found as people made their way to the river. Okay. So I just want to start out with something that I'll read. I'll try not to read a lot during this because I want it to be somewhat kind of free, but I thought this was interesting and a good way to start. Count Frontenac, one of the many Frenchmen who early on visited the St. Lawrence River in this general region, wrote down from his voyage of 1673, and he came not quite this far, but close enough. He wrote this in his journal. He said, July 4th, passed through the most delightful country in the world. So you can kind of see where my theme came from. The entire river was spangled with islands on which were only oaks and hardwood. The soil is admirable, and the borders of the mainland on the north and the south banks are equally handsome, the timber being very clean and lofty, farming a forest equal to the most beautiful in France. So the proud Frenchman. Both banks of the river are lined with prairies full of excellent grass, interspersed with an affinity of beautiful flowers, so that it may be asserted there would not be a more lovely country in the world. It's a very kind of poetic and a little bit romantic kind of vision or view of this place. So the first obviously the first human inhabitants were not Europeans at all. They were Native Americans, they were indigenous inhabitants. And there's a little bit of mystery about the so-called St. Lawrence Iroquois, and I won't have a lot of time to talk about them, but apparently they kind of got pushed out by the Five Nations Iroquois, and there may have been problems with disease as well that many of the Native American populations got from the Europeans, but they kind of disappeared. But not before they had interactions with Jacques Cartier, who's one of the more famous sort of explorers of the area. And he made these notations that turned into these typically French, sort of beautifully rendered pieces of art, trying to somehow both record what they encountered in the world. This is supposedly a village in present location of present-day Montreal of these so-called St. Lawrence Iroquois, but it's sort of turned into this overly perfect diagram. But this is the first architecture. Since I'm going to talk in a way about architecture, that's what I know the most about, and I'm going to use that as this sort of recurring medium of things to talk about, to reveal things about people. This is the first architecture that we would have seen in this area. But of course, the folks that made buildings like these weren't interested in building buildings like these. And they weren't interested in the way of life or frame of mind that would make one build in a way that is biodegradable and coming right directly from the materials of the land. And so there is this idea that these embody with them that Europeans were really married to, which we might call, for lack of a better word, the idea of civilization, the idea of making these lasting and meaningful structures that would say something about how civilized you are, really, in a way. And so I'm showing you a Georgian building. And so I'm going to show you some kind of general, vaguely defined phases of American architecture, just to kind of take the temperature of American culture as revealed in architecture, and then we could see in some local buildings those same ideas kind of growing like mushrooms here in the soil. What happened in America is starting with these kinds of what you might call almost Puritan or stripped down versions of English Baroque, which is the Georgian. What the English did is they looked at classical examples of architecture, and they made them a bit more top buttoned, a bit more stripped down and proper. And thank you very much. And so you can really see that here, because the American examples, in a way, are even more so. And in the case of America, colonial American architecture, the transposition, particularly of this Georgian style to America, it was cold here. And it changed the way buildings look. They kind of have almost the stiffness of, it's not just buttoning your top button, it's kind of holding your collar tight around your neck. But also, there weren't the skilled craftsmen, there wasn't the level of resources, there wasn't just the standard of living in the earlier days. So what you see in the American transposition of English classically based styles is a simpler, humbler version. Kind of makes sense. It also became part of the American ethos, is to think, well, maybe we're not so highfalutin. Maybe we're not so fanciful or showy as those English gentlemen, even though we had our gentlemen and our showy types as well. What happens with classicism in American architecture, and I don't want to load you with too much of this, but there's sort of two branches of it. One is to really do a really more expressive and kind of grand classicism, but you'll see the columns, the classic revival. And the other is to make that really restrained, I keep reaching for my top button, that really restrained, quiet, dignified version of classical English types. What you see in the local ones that I've found is you see that the timeline doesn't really follow the national timeline, that different people decide to make different versions of those English styles from the 1790s to the 1820s, well, 1830s really. They decide to make them based on their own character, whenever the hell they want. But in that general period of the early 1800s, what you see is, ironically, Americans here locally, those with enough money and enough get up and go to build a decent house, imitating in a bit more restrained and I guess they would say dignified version of English styles, the very culture that we just thumbed our nose at, we just kicked out. So there's this English culture that we've rejected. It's not really the culture we've rejected, it's the government we've rejected. It's the government, the monarchy that we've rejected. But anyway, in this early phase, what you see locally, and this is a really, that one I just showed you is a really great example of Georgian. This is a great example, so this is not too far away, of an American version of a classic English house. And so you can see that this person really, you almost want to call them an Anglophile, or they love the order, the kind of conservative, proper, good breeding of this style of house. And there's plenty of examples of that around here. So I guess what I'm saying is that in this period when we had just kicked out the Brits and made our statement against a lot of the things that we associated with them, tyranny, monarchy, and instead substituting values of liberty and down to earth, rights for the common man, at the same time, there's a real imitation of those very qualities in architecture, and very much a continuity of culture, a kind of trim and proper approach to making houses that you can see in houses of this first phase. And it's mainly for the US as a whole, and it roughly fits here, although it lasts a little longer in some places around here. It's roughly from the 1790s that I'm talking about, when things barely get started here until through the 1820s. Some of what gets called the federal style, and now we're talking about people thinking, okay, I really want to make something that for this new country that observes my love for order and proper breeding, all the things that these classical styles with their antecedents in Italian classicism, Palladio and all of that. I want to do something that's proper with good breeding, that's civilized. But I want to do it in a way that makes a show of not being showy. And that's what the federal style is. It's a subtle, restrained kind of style. You can see that throughout these. And then the other, and this is a great example, the Brown Mansion. It's a great example of what an accomplished, perhaps successful, financially person might, gentleman, I mean, we would have been talking about the decisions being made by and large by a man, what their image of what being civilized and being proper and what the right kind of style would be for both for this new nation that's not ostentatious and not foolish with its money, but yet is civilized and has good breeding. That's what these federal style buildings, I think, represent. Some of them get a little weird and wacky, and I think maybe that's the French influence. So, which brings up another point I want to make. Here's Thomas Jefferson's, I'll come to that one. And throughout this whole story, one of the things that really interests me is that obviously from the St. Lawrence River, St. Lawrence named by French folks, there's a strong French cultural history kind of in and around this region. Of course, there's strong British antecedents to the people who came here as well. This area kind of reflects an entanglement with an entanglement with the rivalry between Britain and France. The War of 1812 is an obvious example where fighting between Britain and France really implicated this area. But you also see it in American architecture in general, and then the architecture here. And even the specific history is attached to Britain and attached to France in very different ways and interesting ways. That's what really interested me, is to see those historic connections between Britain and France from this area, but that they're very different. So what I just showed you there is that folks throughout most of the colonies, really all of the colonies, the new nation really, they still thought of themselves as the sons of Britons by and large. And yet there's this French influence that comes in some interesting ways, and this French history that plays into our history in some interesting ways. And it actually starts in the Revolution. I grew up in a town called Lafayette, and many states in the US have a town called Lafayette because of the Marquis de Lafayette and his role as a soldier, as a military man, but also as a conduit for finances from France, supported the colonial army in the Revolutionary War. And one of the supporters of Lafayette, one of the funders behind this, is this cat, Jacques Leray de Chaumont, who figures heavily in this area, came to this area, Jefferson County at least, and was the mover and shaker behind a lot of industries in Jefferson County. And so, right beginning with the moment when we pushed off the Brits, we shed the yoke of the British monarchy, we were in that being supported by the rival. And a lot of the folks who were helping us with that were from France, and they actually they're big in the history of this area. I'll skip over that one. Okay, so what I wanted to say about Jefferson, obviously a big figure in our revolutionary history and the founding of our nation. Jefferson was not as interested in that really stiff, tight, very restrained architecture of that of federalism. He was interested in going back to Roman precedents and making a statement that we, like Rome, like the Roman Republic at least, maybe not the empire, but the Roman Republic. Oh, I got that extra photo floating there. Anyway, that we, like the Roman Republic, are going to be a great nation. We're going to do great things. We're going to be, because we're going to be rational and enlightened and courageous, all of these virtues associated with the Roman Republic of many centuries before. And so he consciously emulated, he went to what the archaeologists were drawing up from their excavations of Roman architecture, and to the books of the Renaissance, Palladio in the Italian Renaissance, who were recording or reinterpreting what the ancient Romans from the ancient Roman Republic had written. So there's this other idea. Remember the federalism and that kind of really restrained, super tight and proper and conservative version of English architecture. A surprising, perhaps, indication that we're still very British here. This is a little bit different version of drawing upon the same classicism that the British were using, but trying to make it look more like the original Roman, because he wanted it to say, we are a great nation, we are a great republic, like the Roman Republic that all of the educated people were learning about in their studies. And so you have classic revival architecture around here, like the Greek revival and Roman revival, just generally this classic revival, that is making a little bit more of an ardent, a little bit more of an active statement that, no, we want to be somebody. We're not just trying to be proper. We're not just doing what a good English gentleman does with maybe a little more restraint and a little less showiness. We want to make some kind of statement that we can adopt an architectural style that says we can become a great nation. And great for them maybe meant something different than we'll see it means later in the 19th century. Great for them, I think, meant enlightened and rational and fair-minded and stoic and brave, all those things they associate with the Romans, with the Roman Republic and the Roman writers that they were learning about in their studies as young men. Well, so Jefferson is an example of someone who's channeling English classicism, wanting to say something new with it, and looking at European culture and all of the great books of architecture of Europe, and wanting to say something specific about America with his house. And at the same time, there is all of the French art. Many of these enlightened French who were supporting and believed in the American Revolution, they mounted a revolution of their own. So for some folks, that meant they needed to leave France because they were the landed gentry, they were the elite. And so there's a series of waves of French aristocrats who come, and again, it was surprising to me how many of them came to Jefferson County. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, who was for a while King of Spain, King of Naples. He ended up coming here, building a house. He lived in Philadelphia, then he lived in New Jersey, married a Jersey girl, had this rather big estate, but he ended up building something in, doesn't look like I've got it here. He ended up building in Cape Vincent for a time and spending money on land here. So this connection to Britain that we see through classical architecture in this period of trying to make a statement of who America is partly made possible by the French and French funds. So I'll return to that history in a little while. The other thing I wanted to mention along the lines of these international connections. So obviously the US had this cultural connection to Britain, and we were looking at what was proper for architecture in Britain in our colonial days. We were imitating British culture, even though we had rejected the English monarchy. Then we were trying to make a new statement using sort of those same tools and those same ideas. There are French connections to our revolution that explain why some of the French wound up here. There's also an Irish connection to this area, which is a little bit of a side note to my talk, but this idea of emigration because of poverty in the Irish famine was something that I noticed in reading through the newspapers from the 1830s and especially 1840s when the famine was really terrible, that this area, and this is this chart that I found that shows 3 to 6% of the population was Irish based on the 1880 census. And so throughout the middle of the 19th century, all of these Irish wound up here. Now that's not really central to what I want to talk about, but I think it's another way in which this area, which I guess I would have thought of as more isolated this early in its history, was very connected to Europe. Okay, so let's just go back to architecture for a little while. There's a sequence in America which is kind of an unfolding of different ideas about who we could be and therefore how we show who we are through our building. Initially, it was we do what a proper Britishman would do, even though we're not British anymore. And then it's the realization, oh, we're not British anymore. Let's make a statement about who we really are. And then once we depart from the constraints of properness, there becomes an epic along with the growing romantic movement that's spreading all over Europe and the Americas, that maybe we can make architecture that expresses something else besides proper values, something else besides the political statement, and really can just be about enjoying life, enjoying nature. And so this is the first time in the towards the middle of the 19th century, when American architecture, American architects, and American culture in general is starting to look out of their windows and say, you know what, we're living in a beautiful place. Why don't we take advantage of that? Why don't we develop that? Why don't we make that part of our civilization? Civilization is not just those ideas of courage and proper behavior and good breeding. Civilization is maybe can be something that recognizes the beauty of nature. Maybe this is a part of our civilization. It does coincide with Romanticism in Europe, but so what we see with the rise of Romanticism is that there's a shift towards something that's more Gothic than classic. Oh, I'll return to that. Part of what we see around here, I noticed a lot of it when we drove in, is the Italianate style. And so one of the expressions of this desire to loosen up and make what was called a more picturesque kind of architecture, something that's got a little more just visual delight to it, and something which can be integrated with the beauties of nature more because it has more decorative elements to it, was the Italianate. So Italian culture had a long history of appreciating nature and a highly developed sense of the decorative. And so the Italianate is seen a lot around here, and I noticed it right on the street just before we arrived here, as an expression of this beginning to look at ourselves and our place a different way. So here's the Walton House from 1853. So a couple of things have happened by now. The technology of building has changed. Now we've got balloon frame architecture, which means we're building things with sticks, with uniform lumber that can be milled in mass quantities because of the technology that we have. So you can have bigger buildings more cheaply. Building with wood is not such a big deal. You don't have to hand hew these giant timbers. But also, it's this, I think of it as sort of the opening of the flower. American ideas about our architectural environment are kind of opening up. So the Gothic that I showed you in those cottages and the Italianate that's here, those two are kind of the dominant poles. So what does that have to do with here? Well, we see buildings here that are doing this. And I guess I just wanted to let you know what my understanding of what those mean is and how people here are embracing and making this fit into the local culture, this idea of a freer and more open, both a freer approach toward history. We can go to any culture in any time, but also more freed from the sense that civilization doesn't include nature, more of a look to nature. And a lot of these buildings in the row houses are some version of the Italianate. And so there's a more urban version. This is Clayton, Main Street of Clayton. As we go in the post-war, post-Civil War era, what you see here is a more kind of efficient and appropriate to brick style version of Italian Tuscan style or Italian villa style. So it continued on after the war, the Italianate, but it begins to become more and more Gothic, more and more expressive in its volumes. So, let's get going here. After World War II, after the Civil War, what happened for American architecture and American culture in general is there was something of a turning inward, and the idea of who we are as a society this idea of looking to nature, and the idea of, for our architectural representation of who we are and what values we want to project in our environment, they became a bit more ambitious, a bit more self-confident, along with the ability to build bigger because the technology allowed us to build bigger, and because the economy began to boom shortly after the Civil War in much of the country, despite what the war did to the South. Up here in the North, things were booming. And so we have the next incursion of French culture in this style here, which is called Second Empire. So what happened in France, which now enters America again, in this post-Civil War period, the much maligned Napoleon, the Bonaparte family, they came back into power. Louis Philippe, Napoleon's grandnephew, took power, was essentially elected. And so he was an emperor in name only. He was sort of an elected emperor, or an emperor with a parliament, like the monarchy in Britain. So the Second Empire style, with these steep mansard roofs, crops up here because it means that America was looking to France, which had reasserted kind of its greatness in the Victorian era. And so this is another example of what the impact of France on American culture is. I think Americans look to Britain for sort of their sense of properness and good breeding, but I think they look to France for the sense of great art. And that idea of finding our own language of visual expression by looking to the great center for art, I think they kind of were afraid to do that until after the Civil War, until after the economic boom that allowed them to build big, to have big ambitions. And I think that has everything to do with what, let's get to the boots, yeah. I think that has everything to do with what, some of these are scrambled. This did something to my slides. Anyway, we can sort of read them. This looking to France, as in this, here, these are great examples of the Second Empire style in Washington, D.C. And then you can see it here in the Thousand Islands, although the images I have aren't quite as good for the Thousand Islands. This is a moment of looking to France as this, where the great art is made. And I go into that one that it did get scrambled. It's a little hard to see. The Paris Opera, I don't know what's happened to these. The Paris Opera House was a statement in Paris during this Second Empire of European culture, European civilization achieving its greatest height. And what happened in America was they realized, with surviving the Civil War, achieving a level of economic vibrancy and economic, just size, power, they realized that we realized here in America that we were worthy of this civilization, this mark of great civilization that we felt that the French did best. Let's put it that way. The French did that best. So the Second Empire style, which really took place, it started, really was the 1870s, as the heyday of the Second Empire style, with these very steep mansard roofs. This is a moment of looking to France, saying France is the place where the great works of art for many centuries have been created, and we're educated enough now and we're worldly enough now to know that and see that. And so that became the rage here. It seemed to be a way to say we are a great nation among the great European nations. We are in this Victorian era of prosperity and ambitious energy. We belong up there with those great nations of Europe. So I think that's what this Second Empire style is about. Also reminds me, and I realized that because I didn't really have time to belabor the point too much, just that connection that keeps coming around, or that theme that keeps replaying in American architectural and cultural history between the sense of order and our sense of connection and ancestry to Britain, but the sense of the expressive, the artistic, the kind of poetic statement of greatness that we realized we wanted to look to France for. It's a kind of a romantic image. It's a kind of a romantic idea. And what you see in these great houses here is that this was a big stage with plenty of space because of the water around the islands, a big stage in which to make these really big statements, these big, bold. You can see how they're almost bulging. It's one of the aspects of the high Victorian architecture. It often seems to be kind of bulging, the volume, it's like it's inflated. And I think that expresses this kind of energy and ambition and the desire to express greatness, but in artistic terms. And so the vastness of the stage, because of all that space around it, look at all that space. It seemed to make a great place to make that statement. So if I think of the places that the Second Empire style, this grand French-inspired, but assimilated to America because it meant we could take our place among the great nations. I think of where that played out most dramatically. Washington, D.C. is an obvious place with big federal government buildings. It's a very grandly scaled building with grand boulevards designed by a Frenchman. But this is another place. The Thousand Islands is another place where that grand vision actually had the space, and largely because of the water, because we're talking about islands, because of all the waterfront, that had the space to really make that giant and kind of that proclamation through architecture. So, the other thing that is woven in with the post-Civil War stuff, the Gothic style, which is what everybody thinks of as Gothic cathedrals, just think of it as the vertical pointy style. Really, it's everything being pulled up, like plants reaching up towards the sun. That's the essence of the Gothic style. It was born in France. And so classical architecture is what the British were obsessed with at the founding of this country. So that's what we inherited from Britain is classicism, order and geometry. What we inherited from the French is something that is reaching up toward the sky and bulging out and flexing its muscles. It's such a different kind of character. And who were the figures that were important for America? These dashing Frenchmen, Napoleon himself, the ultimate dashing character, but Lafayette. These are sort of romantic figures, whereas I think our connection to Britain is much more staid and I don't know what happened to these layouts, but much more staid. So when you see the verticality, when you see the inflation and the kind of big shoulders of these buildings, it's really here that you could do it. And it's now we've got America talking about itself in a different key. It's a different feeling. The Civil War, you might have thought of the Civil War as something that would be depressing and shattering and, economically depressing. And yes, for much of the South, it was, particularly what today is the Southeast. But for up here, it almost was more something to celebrate and something to prove the resilience of America, because after all, Lincoln had saved the Union. The North, the Union had saved itself. This, for the people, of the people, for the people, by the people, that this shall not perish from the earth, that was accomplished. So there's reason for this kind of inflated and optimistic and positive view. And it just so happened that it was under Napoleon's grandnephew and the creation of another empire in Paris. So they, that's such a grand thing to say you have an emperor, even though you haven't given the power of an emperor. That kind of makes sense that in this time of economic and psychic kind of confidence and jubilation and industry and busyness, we would look to France and to this empire and to that capital of the most artistic buildings and the most glorious art, perhaps, in recent centuries. Now, towards the turn of the century, what architecture around here did is it began to tilt a bit back to the English. If you take, I've always recognized in studying the history of architecture that there are kind of these two families when you look at Western architecture, the more classical with logic and geometry and order and a balance of verticals and horizontals, and the more Gothic or unclassical, which is more about an organic idea. And the more Gothic, the more organic is always associated more with France, even though they love their classicism too. But compared to Britain, it was the more anti-classical, the more organic, the more expressive, the more poetic. And Britain, the more logical, the more staid, the more orderly, the more proper. These are always in tension. First, it was Britain, then the French and the Gothic began to come in, and then this glorious moment of French influence and French poetry and French in the Second Empire style. And then what you start to see as we move from America's centennial celebration in 1876, at which some British architects showed some very convincing country houses that people really liked. And they seemed to give relief for those who didn't want, for those who couldn't maybe relate to the grand theater of the Second Empire, to that over-the-top haunted house look. For those, the American Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia showed a number of works from Britain and the British contribution to that international exhibition that made Americans remember their ancestral connection to British kind of staid, proper top button button. After all, that was always a part of who we were. That was one strain of who we were. Are we more British or are we more French? We're probably more British. It's just that the French is this lovely thing that sometimes we just want to embrace, like it's glorious, but couldn't last. So I think of the Second Empire, it's kind of a party. It's a big celebration. Look, we survived the Civil War. Look at our economy, it's booming. Look at the things we can accomplish. But really, that's not really totally who we are. And so what starts to happen is we start to move, the inflation starts to pull tighter and almost not implode, but you don't get the sense of the heavy detailing, the big aggressive details of the Second Empire and of the verticality. We start to see stuff that's more horizontal. Now it might seem weird. I know my students always struggle with this. I'm always telling them things about how horizontal something is, how vertical something is, what shape is in it. Is it geometric? Like, what does that matter? Isn't that just an abstract academic thing? But we are, as human animals, we respond to these things. And they become the language in the same way that you use certain kinds of sounds in a poem to convey the sad part of the poem and other kinds of sounds to convey another kind of poetry. That's what happens in architecture too. And so the shift toward more horizontal, or at least more balancing vertical and horizontal lines, things that are more balanced, that are more staid, that are less grand and glorious, less curving, less muscle, right? Like the Second Empire was, there's less of that because it couldn't be maintained. And so you start to see that even something like there's the Second Empire. Here is the Gothic from a little bit before that. And then, yeah, right, that's Alex. Right. Here is those big shoulder buildings with all of the towers and all of the upward thrust and, like some great glorious cathedrals. Let's get to what is next is a beginning to focus more on the horizontal, more on a decorative surface that is not so muscular, attenuated details. Yes, it's still got a little bit of Gothic flair in that little turret, but what they managed to create in this Queen Anne style, and you see a lot of that around here too, is they managed to find a balance, and this was what the Victorian architects were really masters at, is finding a way to balance this verticality, this vertical kind of poetic expression with the horizontal, to balance order with movement, with expression. And so what they did is found various versions of English end of the Middle Ages and English Renaissance houses. Actually, let me show you that. Yeah. They arrived at the Queen Anne style. This was something that, let's see, where's Richard Norman Shaw? I should show you Richard Norman Shaw. It seems like you got left out. Okay. This was the new compromise, and I say it shifted toward a British influence, a British new version of the British country manner, but it didn't go completely over to that really. Remember those early, very tight, very proper, very buttoned up colonial houses? It didn't go that far. There's actually a lot of life to these buildings. The Queen Anne has a lot of life to it. What they managed to find, the Queen Anne, and what the English, the leading English, the kind of pioneering English architects of the post-Civil War period, post our Civil War, that who were exhibiting, for example, at the Philadelphia exhibition. What they managed to find is something that's kind of like these medieval Gothic towers and castles that blends with an orderly and somewhat kind of logical, symmetry, using squares and circles and triangles that have a certain sense of stability and order to them. So they managed to find a balance. Well, let's get going. Now, what emerged in America as a specifically American invention for wealthy people's recreational architecture, which is something that popped up here in a big way. It's called the shingle style. And it's based on this idea of creating sort of the English gentleman's country house from the Middle Ages or from the Renaissance. And it actually became, in many examples, quite free. But it was that freedom and that expressiveness, you can see how it's kind of collage of different pieces, was balanced by the fact that it uses carefully proportioned rectangles and semicircles, and it wasn't so overweeningly castle-like. So you have these buildings where the elements, like these equilateral triangles and a nice strong horizontal, are kind of keeping things in order. These were, by and large, the shingle style, and this more expansive and large-scale Queen Anne style. Examples of the Queen Anne were great for vacation houses, for places that you wanted to have a lot of different functions, places you wanted to have a lot of different porches and spaces for different recreation. So it fit for this area really well at a time when now that vacation activity was just gearing up. So why did that vacation, why did the boom start here? I'm not there yet. Anybody know what the event was that really kind of kicked vacationing here into high gear and brought like national attention to Thousand Islands? Anybody know? Yeah.
Grant visited.
Yeah, exactly. So in 1872, President Grant visited, let's see if I got that. Oh, so there's Richard Honshaw. So there's the English example that was inspiring at the Philadelphia exhibition. This was the English example that was inspiring these houses. So Grant's visit to Pullman Island, to Castle Rest in 1872, this was when he, Ulysses S. Grant, was gearing up for re-election. And so he was the president. It's a big deal to have the president come here. And George Pullman was a big deal in his own right. He's the guy that created the Pullman car and this company that made tons of money on selling luxury in train travel. Luxury train travel was something whose time had come in the Victorian era. And Pullman understood how to make that profitable. Grant befriended Pullman. Pullman invited Grant to come here. There was an element of that visit by Grant that was, there's Castle Rest. There's an element of that visit. See, I got an image of the visit here. Yeah. This actually is Ulysses S. Grant. There was an element of it that was, he had to take into consideration that he's running for re-election. And so they had a big dinner, inviting tons of local people to this big sort of outdoor picnic. And they brought lots of newspaper reporters to the various things that they did. So there was an element of it that was for show. But then there was an element of it that was for real recreation. And so Grant's coming to this place, to me, this is sort of like the moment when that real identity for this place for a long time to come is set. And in some ways, it's still echoing in what the nation sees in the Thousand Islands, still an echo of this moment. It's interesting that Grant was kind of an American archetype, sort of this common man turned into general, because he had to go to war even though he didn't particularly want to, and then turned into president because he was drafted as a candidate even though he didn't particularly want to. But he did his duty, and he was a very determined man, but a humble man. He is sort of an American architect. So is George Pullman, who, there's the Pullman cars. There's George and his family. Doesn't show up so well on the screen, but here's Pullman's house in Chicago in the Second Empire style, and then he shifts to this more romantic kind of castle on Pullman Island. But these are these two into this more English influenced style when he gets here. These are these two national figures. George Pullman was really famous and admired as kind of an innovator and a successful businessman, someone that understood where America was at and knew how to make money from it. And Grant as this leader and this everyman arisen to this position of power and importance, but someone who maintained his humility. They came together at this island, and again, just like the Second Empire style, having this great big space that it could kind of show off in, this big space that it was, you could build big buildings with big ambitions and then have the space to not seem overwhelming. So this became a space, in a sense, the Thousand Islands became like a theater set for this grand drama that really was about America, really was, for this moment, I think the Thousand Islands became like the theater in which America saw what America's about, at least in some measure. Having your president go there, but a very kind of unique president. Other than Harry Truman, I can't think of any president as more sort of, common sense, no nonsense, of the common people kind of person. And hence someone that just people couldn't help projecting the American character, like he's an American. Coming to this, and then Pullman as the success story, Pullman as the relentless genius. Pullman actually started his work as an engineer, moving houses to widen the Erie Canal. So he has a New York connection. He's from New York State. And his first big accomplishment was to figure out how to move houses out of the way without destroying them to widen the Erie Canal. Then he lifted up houses in Chicago, block by block, like hundreds of houses, in order to allow space under them for flood control. He was this kind of engineering and business genius. And so these two figures that represent, American political culture and our aspirations, ethical and otherwise, going through the Civil War, being on the side of the Union that was on the side of freedom for the slaves. Grant represented so much of what America believed in or wanted to believe it believed in. And Pullman represented so much of what America actually did, how it made its living, how it became a great nation. These are two ways, these two figures to me represent two ways in which America was achieving a kind of greatness. Lincoln's greatness, you read the speeches of Lincoln and you might believe that America was becoming or re-becoming a great nation. And then you look at geniuses like Pullman and you see the other way in which America is achieving an economic and technological greatness. They come together at this moment. And again, I just think this space of the river and the islands makes this wonderful place where, one reason, why did George Pullman come here? Because he could separate himself from people, but at the same, and then he could have lots of space that he could totally control. He could have people visit him, like the president, because he's important enough, but he could control what everybody did because he owns the whole island and you can't go anywhere. So it's kind of a great formula for this moment. It's a kind of amazing, to me, this was one of the interesting things. The French connection to this place, and then this moment where, earlier, I think what I was talking about is trying to talk about, and I don't think I've really worked it out yet, but trying to talk about the international connections to this place. But here, in the moment when America is really trying to, all of the people that are writing about America and building about America and thinking about America, that are making culture, they're talking about who we are, who we want to be in the wake of Lincoln's great life and then death. This is a time when we're thinking, can't we be a great nation among all the great nations of the world? Can't we be maybe the greatest nation? Because we're this great experiment that we didn't let fail. And because we obviously have this economic, this beacon of economic opportunity and this engine of economic production and innovation. So at a time when it's beginning to become apparent, we are among the great nations of the world. Maybe we're the greatest nation than people would have thought. At that very moment, these two figures come together in this space. Now, I've somewhat departed from the architecture, but what's happening with the architecture as it shifts from this French imperial, super expressive, kind of buffed up Second Empire with its great big, with this big space that it needs. When we shift to the more English country house, you can feel it's a gentler, more integrated into nature. It's got more variety. It's more what they call picturesque, asymmetry and interest. And not so severe and imposing, that also works really well with this scenery, but in a different way. It's not so dramatic, it's more pretty, it's more beautiful, it's more evocative. So that becomes the architecture that these important people are building with. Now, what happened? Yeah, okay, so this is, I don't know why someone else is there. This is
Singer Castle.
Singer Castle, yes. So Bourne, Gilbert Bourne, the head of the Singer company, owner of the Singer sewing machine company, he built this with this in mind. So what this is this is a castle that was described in a novel by Sir Walter Scott. I know I don't want to go too long. This was described in a novel by Sir Walter Scott. It's a real castle that used to exist in England. And it was described and spoken of in this very romantic novel of all kinds of intrigue and supernatural things happening, and the battle among a deposed king and his return to his nation victorious, all kinds of dramatic romantic events in this novel. But the description of the castle caught the attention of Bourne. The novel is Woodstock by Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott grew up playing in this ruin here. So he was part of the Romantic movement in Europe, which again, like in America, was a turning away from just ideas and proper codes of behavior driving culture, but instead experience, sensation, like enjoy life, feel life. That was the Romantic movement. You can imagine a child playing in this or adults visiting this, how the evocation, the sense of a long lost past, it produces a feeling in you. And so that was the kind of thing that Sir Walter Scott learned to exploit in his novels. And in turn, his readers, like Singer, or like Bourne, I think it's Bourne, yeah, Gilbert Bourne. This is Sir Walter Scott. This is where Sir Walter Scott's buried. I mean, look at that, this ruin, this romantic ruin. He picked up on that romanticism and thought, okay, now that's the next thing that we want to do here. It's not even the picturesque, it's the romantic. It's something that is evoking a lost time. It's something that is going elsewhere. It's not even about a vision of who Americans should be. It doesn't have that much responsibility to it. It's just a fancy. This is from Sir Walter Scott, poetry from Sir Walter Scott. I just thought it was interesting because it talks about place. Breathed there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, this is my own, my native land, whose heart hath never within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering in a foreign land. If such there breathe, go mark him well, for no minstrel raptures swell. There's no music for someone who is so dead that their heart doesn't beat faster when they're going home. And so I thought that was an interesting thing in relation to this. It's probably a place where I should end. I just want to show you, these are two memorials for Sir Walter Scott, the classic, the Gothic. Now I'm going to use these for my students because I'm always trying to explain to them these two poles of France and everywhere else, basically, in European history. But I think that nicely captures that connection of things that were happening in Europe and of visions of America. I don't think that peak moment of national self-expression and national drama, really it's drama, when Grant came to the Thousand Islands, that was ever again achieved. And I think part of the reason that things kind of climbed down from there and the Thousand Islands were never quite as important, even though financially, and the amount of tourism just went up, but they were never as much national focus. It's partly because this romantic vision was not something that captured the national imagination. It was no longer an expression of who we are as a country. It was more an expression of the fancy of one person's mind. And I think that's where I want to leave it.
Questions?
Is the gingerbread trim on the houses on Wellesley Island, is that Italianate or is that its own thing, or?
So that is a product of partly America's own version of Romanticism in the middle of the 19th century, where the Gothic and Italianate, those are the two styles pretty much that use that gingerbread stuff. And it's partly a function of the fact that now they have the tools they could do that. It's not an accident that as soon as we have saws that are much more capable of just, doing the fretwork, then all of a sudden you have styles that take advantage of that, and you have buildings that are just doing this. Just in the same way that when we start to build with balloon frame structure instead of the heavy beams, then you get a bigger and more inflated architecture, because they could do that. Yeah.
Whose influence were all the stone houses around here?
Well, if you mean stone, if you mean who influenced them making stone, that's a more response to local materials. I guess I would just say two things about that. One, you find stone houses mostly in a classical mode. They just don't lend themselves as well, except when these guys built castles, they had enough money to make the stone do whatever you want to do. But most of those stone houses are earlier. I think the prevailing trend is increasingly to wood as you get later in the 19th century. So they're necessarily going to be more kind of trim, staid, classical, colonial style, just based on classical ideas. But you can't make stone, unless you got a lot of money, you can't make it do things as easily as you can make wood. And the technology for building with wood just took off, and the technology for building with stone didn't change that much. So you couldn't do tons more with it. It still was, demanded to work with. I think early on, there was in American colonial architecture, and this happened with brick too, kind of a belief that if you could just pull it off with stone or brick, you were saying something about yourself. You were making a permanent thing. You were making the building part of the nation forever, Whereas with wood, maybe it's going to burn down, maybe it's going to rot. You gotta keep it up real well. And I think there was always that idea that building with stone really means something different than building with wood. But it was a lot easier to build with wood, unless you got a whole lot of really good stone and a bunch of cheap labor. Maybe from Ireland, you did get some stonemasons fleeing the famine. And there were certain periods, actually you can look at American architectural history, and you could see certain periods when there's some outbreak of real hunger or bad conditions in Europe, and you get the refugees coming to the US, and all of a sudden you get all kinds of cheap labor making all kinds of stuff happen in America. I know that happened where I went to college. A lot of the campus was built in the 1930s, and there was basically extreme hunger in Sicily during the 1910s and 20s, and all these Sicilian stonemasons came over, and they were able to use them as really cheap labor, but skilled cheap labor. But that doesn't know what's happened. So I really appreciate your kind of patience with my only half worked out talk here, but I hope you saw that it represents, for me, a genuine interest in what this place really means in the whole big picture of American and Western culture. And I actually kind of want to work more on this now. because I think it's a really interesting story. I didn't really go into a lot of the specific French connections other than to talk about that they were there and what they meant. It's a little harder to do with the time. I don't want to keep it too long, but for me, it's kind of amazing how many things, why is it that this place was so important for these, particularly for these people in France? The St. Lawrence, of course, is a border between Canada and the US, so it's this place of rivalry built in, and that's what the War of 1812 was all about, being, War of 1812 being fought along here is all about that. But also, New York State was really important, and so what was the wilderness in New York State was northwestern and western New York. And so if you're a Frenchman, and you probably got to get out of Dodge because the guillotine is executing people. France went through a whole long period of just a lot of violence. Then where do I want to go? I want to invest. The French have been coming to this region for centuries. Why don't I go check that out and see if maybe they had something going on? I'll invest in timber, the Liray, this guy Liray de Chamont, ironworks, timber, the potash industry. He financed those, but it really started because his dad believed in the American Revolution. And so then his dad never got fully paid back. So he came over here thinking, I got to get some of that money back from my dad. So I'm going to make a lot of money here. And it's kind of amazing to me that these world events like the French Revolution and Napoleon's deposition and then returning and then Waterloo and then the Second Empire, like these world events really played out. The development of this area really reflected and participated in, not just reflected, they're not just the river delta where all the stuff is dumped. They had an impact. What happened here, the timber that was here, the factories that were here, the cheap Irish and German labor that was here, that had an impact on France and on Britain, but particularly France. And these folks who were trying to stabilize their own economic situation. Yeah.
So you're right on the edge of a major German influence with George C. Bull.
Yeah, I didn't really get into the Bolt Castle, I guess because it's the most famous one and I had to leave something off. So, but yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that so he's in the 20th century and he's pursuing another one of these fanciful visions. And so it's not a new thing, but he sort of did it bigger and more so than anyone before. And in the way, he almost put a bookend on the whole thing, kind of like, no one's going to do it bigger than this. That's it. And that's why it's kind of over after that.
You had a slide that, I'm sorry. I had a question. I'm not a student of architecture, but the modern construction, let's say within the last 50 years, of major commercial buildings like the new hotel here, or really expensive houses, $1 million now. I don't see any dominant theme.
Yeah.
Even though I don't know that much about architecture, but it seems like it's all kinds of styles.
Well, just think about, is there a dominant cultural identity in America? I mean, we're about as poly-pluralistic as we've ever been, and I think that is as good an explanation as I can come up with, that there just isn't that sense of like, this is our national identity, or this is where we want to go, this is what we want to express about ourselves. And that really was, it's hard for us to realize today how much that really was what they wanted to do. You read the architectural journals and they're like, we need to say this about ourselves when we build. And the architects would talk about that and decide, how do we do that? No one would do that today. No one would say, I want to make a statement about who America is or who we want to be or what we believe in. No, I want to do a cool building, or I want to do something that's innovative or cutting edge or whatever. And that's fine. But I think that's why there isn't a unity, because culturally there isn't really either. So what's dominant?
Well, unique boathouses are a feature of this area, and that's something that we can have that others can't because of the river. I mean, books have been written, many pictures have been taken of all the
Sure.
different kinds of boathouses on the river.
Right.
So that's something unique to here that they don't
Yes.
even have in Watertown, really.
And it's probably something that has as much similarity of style as any architecture does, but there's still a lot of variety. But it's probably more similar. But then if you just look at everything else around it, it's beginning to become more and more different from each other,
Right.
and less homogeneous.
Mhm.
And then, it's always this question, like, people are always sad to hear if some culture or language in the world is dying out or disappearing, or it's like some species going extinct. And yet at the same time, we also know that these differences are one of the things that make us clash and fragmented. It'd be nice to have some kind of harmonious coming together in our nation. And culture can kind of help, things like architecture, and today would probably be more movies and books and so on. They can help that. So is there some kind of healthy balance between a lot of different interesting things going on in the culture, and yet also kind of wanting to move in the same direction in some sense, which was very much a part of things in the past. There was much more of a sense of, yeah, this really is what we do believe in, and this is the direction we are moving in. Of course, there were people left out of that. There were whole groups left out of that completely. So that's part of our situation today, is that we're actually recognizing who was left out of that conversation.
You had a slide in there that said Bonnie Castle,
Yeah,
and you slid right over that.
I know.
There might have been a reason for that.
So Bonnie Castle was the kind of the first, and I apologize for how this kind of unexpectedly got a little bit of a shambles in terms of.
That was
You
it.
wanted-
was
you
that?
wanted- There you go.
Here. Oh,
Yeah.
Next slide.
So this is actually Queen Anne style. So I probably should have shown this because it's a more convincing example of how, in the slide away from the glorious French kind of bulging and great big ornamental details, what I call a florid and muscular style, moving toward the English, how much more kind of stable and kind of orderly and organized it is, even though the Queen Anne style can become quite, interesting and varied. It also allowed itself, that's what the amazing thing about the Queen Anne style. You can either be like this, which looks pretty damn orderly, right? It's pretty neat. Or it could become kind of really easygoing and flowing and lots of decorative stuff and fanciful. This is not castle-like. It doesn't deserve to be called a castle. But some of the Queen Anne stuff really is castle-like, with turrets and castle-like. So it's a really interesting style and very flexible, fluid style in that way. And I just think it's the balance between the medieval castle idea and the Greek temple, Roman temple idea. You can see the Roman temple there right in the front of it. It's just different proportions.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I shouldn't have asked. I'm glad you came back. You can't tell me anything. Like I said, I kind of not far enough into this to come up with a polished talk, but hopefully I threw out enough stuff.
Well, I think some of the things that you look at the exterior of these buildings, but then you get inside, like you get inside Bonnie Castle, you get inside Singer Castle, you get into some of these homes, the ornateness and the style inside is extremely exciting.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I was conscious that I just wasn't going to be able to go inside, and partly because I just don't have enough access to the images in. But and sometimes there's this play between, like, the building will last longer than the furniture, so the stylistic changes in the furniture are going to be different.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Other